Okay, today we are going to talk about the evolution and diversity of plants. Here's some of the highlights. Plants first showed up about 475 million years ago. That's when they moved on to land. Up until then, everything was in the water, in the oceans. We talked in lab about a couple things like vascular tissue, like xylem and phloem. Xylem moves water, phloem moves nutrients and sugars. We talked about the development of pollen, which helped increase genetic diversity by using sexual reproduction. And then the origin of the flowering plants, the most advanced plants we have, the angiosperms, about 130 million years ago. Plants moving on to land was the first big step in the evolution of plants. They moved out of the water, and what allowed this to happen were tidal systems. Okay? If you have a moon in orbit around a planet that causes oceans to have low tides and high tides, you have a zone between water and land that's sometimes underwater and sometimes not underwater. And so this is called a transition zone, and allows it did allow our plants to migrate from the oceans first into the tidal pools, then from the tidal pools into the wet marshy areas adjacent to oceans, and so forth and so on. They spread slowly over all the land masses. That real important date is 475 million years ago. Plants move on to land. Okay? These are some of the other important dates, and we talked about all of these in lab. Here is a cladogram. A cladogram basically maps genetic similarities between plant groups. Okay? And it looks at them in the fossil records. Now, we have all these mosses and liverworts. The bryophytes were the first things to show up in the fossil record. They weren't very tall. They weren't very big. They had to be in real wet areas, marshy areas. All right, and then we start seeing the fossil record shows the first plants with vascular tissue. These are things like some of the ferns and mosses. All right, the next big one were the development of seeds. Now, seeds allow plants to store energy and nutrients around the genetic material so that when the seed sprouts, it's already got a built-in source of nutrients that it can use and pull to undergo the processes of growth. And then the most advanced evolutionary adaptation were the flowering plants, the angiosperm. Okay? Seeds showed up in gymnosperm, flowers in the angiosperm, and these are the most advanced plants. They include a lot of symbiotes and symbiosm. They use bees, different kinds of pollinators. So let's look at the highlight. Here's xylem and phloem. Phloem transports sugar, xylem transports water. And here we can see a slide showing this vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is very similar to blood vessels. You know, you have arteries and veins in animals. You have xylem and phloem in plants. There's the seeds showing up in the gymnosperms. Now, the first seeds didn't usually have a real hard covering like the more advanced the angiosperms. Angiosperms produce things like pecans with a hard shell. These have a softer shell, and these are pine nuts. And they're in a very thin little layer that protects them, and they're released from here after they're fertilized. These are the female cones, and we talked about that in lab. Then we had the angiosperms, and the big thing about angiosperms is these flowering structures. These tend to attract symbiotes to help with pollination. And once you pollinate a female egg, it becomes a seed. Here is the alternation of generations. We talked about that in lab. You have a plant that produces gametes, basically sperm and eggs, and then you have a plant that produces spores, which are just basically clones of the plant. The clone plant, the spore-producing plant, is called the sporophyte, and the plant that undergoes sexual reproduction is called the gametophyte. All right? So basically, the sporophyte will grow a bunch of copies of itself, and each of those will put out these spores, and they'll grow into male and female plants. And then the output of the male and female plants, the gametes, the sex and the egg and the sperm combined to become the sporophyte. The spores come out and become gametophytes. Now, some plants have one plant that has both the male and female parts on it. These are called heterosporous. Some plants have separate plants for male and female. Here is a definition of the alternation of generations showing diploid versus haploid. Diploid means you have a full complement of the chromosomes of your species. So what you look at in the mirror every day is a diploid organism. Basically, you have 46 chromosomes and 23 pairs. The haploid generation takes that, for us, it would take that 46 chromosomes and split them in half, one chromosome from each pair, to produce either an egg or a sperm. That means haploid. Haploid, if you think about it, just means half the number of chromosomes. HA, half, HA, haploid. That's a good way to remember it. We also refer to it as diploid 2N and haploid 1N to show that we only have one of each chromosome. In the diploid, we have the complete pair of chromosomes. Okay. Let's see. Let's talk about some of the more primitive bryophytes. This is kind of a rehash of what we've done in lab, so we're going to go over it pretty quickly. Bryophytes are seedless. They don't have vascular tissue. And because they don't have vascular tissue, they can't get very tall because it's not very efficient to fight gravity and move water to the top of a tall plant. Basically, the materials move from cell to cell within the plant by diffusion and osmosis. Osmosis, remember, is just the diffusion of water. And these show some of the different organisms in this very primitive group. The gymnosperms. The gymnosperms include, not the gymnosperms, these are the ferns and mosses. This is a whisk fern. This is probably the one fern that you do recognize, the true ferns. Okay, and the true ferns like this is the sporophyte generation. Its gametophyte generation is microscopic. So the male-female plants of this species you can't see with the naked eye. The sporophyte, like this one, is the macro. Gymnosperms, naked seeds. They don't have that hard outer covering. There's several groups. Ginkgo trees and cycads are more primitive. And the ones you're going to be most familiar with are going to be the conifers. Okay? Conifers are your evergreen trees. Your Christmas tree is a conifer. The little evergreen bushes are conifers. Okay, conifers are called conifers because they tend to produce some type of a cone. Pine trees are conifers. Angiosperms produce seeds and fruits. And you can see they have these flowering structures to attract insects or any kind of aid in fertilizing and exchanging genetic material. When you exchange genetic material through some type of sexual reproduction, what happens is you increase the genetic diversity of the species. And that's always a good thing. It makes it more resilient, less likely to die out and go extinct. Here's the angiosperm life cycle. And let's see if we can find a plant here. Okay, we will cover I want to actually show you the parts of a flower. We'll cover that in another lecture. Some interesting things that have been happening recently due to warming temperatures in the world. The permafrost. Permafrost is a layer of soil that is normally frozen 12 months out of the year. We have seen the permafrost has started to melt. And so we're able to drill through this. We are starting to find ancient seeds and ancient pollen and ancient plants and things buried deep in like the northern tundras. We can now get to them. And so we're finding stuff from extinct plants. We're also finding bacteria, viruses, all kinds of stuff. In Russia, as the tundra has melted, it has turned up a huge number of frozen Ice Age animals like woolly rhinoceros and woolly mammoths and things like that. And we're using drilling in the permafrost to actually kind of look at the prevalence in our society of certain plant groups. So if we look at 300,000 years ago, the mosses were not very widespread, but then they took a big jump up. We got an increase. Shrubs have been steadily increasing, but herbs have been steadily decreasing. So this means increasing genetic diversity, increasing in actual or decreasing, increasing and decreasing in availability, how much of the area is covered by them, things like that. And it just shows that, basically these different plant groups are competing for resources. All right. That wraps up chapter 16. I will get to the next chapter as quickly as I can. Thanks.